Okay, yeah, but thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Okay, so I'm Joel. I kind of work between art, design, and research, somewhere in that area. And one of the kind of big inspirations for me and in my work is kind of, how design tools you kind of learn from algorithms and biological processes. And, what is an algorithm? It's just a process for solving a problem, right? And, designers, we all have our internal processes, we all have methods for solving things. And that's what algorithms are. They're just a series of steps for solving problems. Biology is a series of systems and structures, and I think there's a lot of kind of beauty and inspiration that can be taken from these systems. And so that's kind of what motivates kind of me and some of my work. And I just kind of briefly to start this off, I think it's a really exciting time to be in design, to be in art, to be in the creative field, to be kind of incredible new technologies that are coming out that I think are going to really transform a lot of the process. And so I just want to kind of like start off everything with some of the kind of early advances that got me really excited about this field that have come out just in the last few years. There's things, in structural optimization, things that are kind of inspired by the optimization within biology. This thing called topology optimization, where you can take a form and what if you could optimize it, the way like a branch of a tree works. You take off material where it's not needed, you add it where it is needed. And you kind of run this optimization, and here's Doris Varman's, famous bone share that's optimized this way. Here's kind of this like structural piece. And so we're seeing these kinds of algorithms that are able to produce optimization for us. And another area I think is very exciting and very interesting is something called generative design, which is related to optimization. This is Autodesk's office building, where here are a bunch of options the algorithm created and presented to the designers based off their constraints. So you put in your parameters, it creates options which it then gives to you, which is related to optimization, but it's the process of kind of interacting with those generative models. I think that's something that's coming up, kind of this very current issue, or very current kind of practice that's emerging mostly within architecture right now. And they designed their offices in Toronto with this. And then kind of another third really exciting area I think that's kind of happening in technology and design, some of like the generative models that are coming out of the machine learning world, where these are faces that are imagined. This is an algorithm by NVIDIA, where these faces are all kind of imagined, where you can put in numbers and create faces. So I'm just kind of like framing this way. These are kind of like the capacities that algorithms just in the last 4 or 5 years have kind of started to develop. And you also see things in like kind of the reinforcement learning, machine learning side of things, where this robot kind of learned to walk over many generations. And so, all of these kind of generative models, generative systems, if it's for faces, if it's for robots, if it's for, this one's pretty fun, if it's for, structures or furniture, we're seeing computers that are able to kind of generate tremendously optimized things and diversity of things. And so I think kind of the future of design tools are going to be built around some of these emerging technologies. And so that's what kind of really excites me. And so yeah, what are the best ways to leverage these technologies into usable design tools that enhance and kind of augment creativity? That's kind of one of the things that motivates me in my work. Okay, so who am I? I studied a combined degree in fine art and computer science at Carnegie Mellon. I've done some work in sculpture. I worked in a bioinformatics lab for 2 years, doing like sequence analysis, and I did some like tech startup stuff. So it's a little bit kind of all over. I'll just briefly show you some of my past work. Well, a lot of this talk is kind of about some of the generative work, but there's also some other work that I'll just bring in to kind of show how I think about it. So I think a lot about like craft and technique as well. I do a lot of I do furniture design also, kind of like lamp design, like mid-century modern, inspired with like kind of traditional materials, a little Japanese influence. Won't talk too much about that.
Yeah. Joel, are you open to questions as we go through?
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, please. Yeah, feel free to interrupt or say anything, or if I'm not looking, just say something, or raise your hand. Okay, I also do some figure sculpture, and so, I like doing hands-on stuff too, not some generative stuff. I come from also a computational, but also kind of very hands-on, kind of technique and studio-based background. And I kind of got into like computational sculpture was my path into all this. Here it is in kind of parametric sculpture, here I did some simulation and just dropping sculptures. This is a sculpture that I made, and then I scanned it. I had dropped it in the computer as kind of like a dialogue between kind of a random computational system and then like the traditional craft. This is kind of my bridge into things. Okay, and then a couple years ago, I got very, very motivated or inspired by this question: how would you design a 3D printed building? And I was visiting some labs where they were 3D printing. They're doing building scale 3D printers. But a lot of the buildings they were actually printing looked very traditional. Most of them didn't have rounded corners. They looked like traditional buildings, kind of planar, right angles. And that didn't make sense to me because a lot of those things came from traditional building techniques, things that had to be shipped and easy to assemble, wood and brick and things that were kind of planar. And with 3D printing, none of that restrictions still really applied. And so I was coming from kind of generative sculpture. I was working in a biology lab and very inspired by some of the systems in biology. And I was kind of wondering, how would you actually kind of design an organic 3D printed building? Because, a lot of when new technologies come out, new affordances come out, the design tools and, always kind of lag behind. The teleplay is a great example. We put plays in TV before we knew what to do with the medium. And so that's kind of how I saw some of these 3D printed buildings where you have the capacity for really organic, interesting shapes and you're doing kind of planar things. And so this kind of really intrigued me. What if you could think about it more like this, more like this and less kind of like planar right angles. And that kind of, and so what if you could do it, with multiple objectives, and that's kind of where the complexity starts to bring into it. You're not just building a building. What if you wanted to build a really optimized building? The same way, like this tree is a very, very optimized form. It's the result, millions of years of evolution. It's solving a lot of complicated problems. It has to stay up. It has to, collect the light. It has to, avoid, insects eating it. And so, how could we bring in some of that complex optimization into the construction process? And there are, a lot of people doing simulations. Autodesk is doing a lot of work with optimization. But I think how as a designer could you interact with all these optimizations that are possible and are often done discreetly? So on the left, here's some acoustical modeling that's being done. On the right is a bunch of travel path analysis that's being done of the building. So a lot of software and technology advances are enabling this kind of analysis of stuff. However, what I think has been lacking is how can the designer interact with all this capacity and ability in a kind of intuitive way, in a holistic way that kind of ties together all that optimization. And that kind of where the city is not a tree really ties in. For those who weren't here for the discussion before, the city is not a tree is an essay by Christopher Alexander, where he talks about kind of the limits of human ability, human design. It was in the 60s and kind of during this response, and we talked about before, to some kind of urban master plan systems. And he comes at it from a mathematical perspective. He's both a mathematician and also an architect. And he, has these two mathematical structures that he uses kind of to make the comparison. On the right is a tree, and the left is a semi-lattice. And the real kind of, point here is that, the way humans think are often very hierarchical. You have groups within groups. And so, the mathematical definition of the two is a little less important. The semi-lattice, every two sets, their intersection is also a member of the set. But the point being, complex things, the groups have overlap. A city is not a tree in terms of the west side is residential, the east side is commercial, within, this district we have, these blocks we have this. It's much more overlap between all the different parts. In a sense, every spot in a city is its own neighborhood. You live there, you have your local places where you work, and you go to the park. And you don't want everything segregated and hierarchical, the way you would structure, maybe an army or something where you have kind of groups and groups and groups going all the way up and all the way down. There's all these kind of interwoven relationships, and that's just a very complicated structure. It's a very complicated design problem. We talked about the amount of complexity from a mathematical perspective is very, very great. And as I also mentioned before, he also it's kind of empirical. He does research showing that humans actually do think this way. When they're presented patterns and asked to reproduce the patterns, you will often take those overlapping parts and reduce them to trees. So there's kind of some innate tendencies and biases to our thinking. And so, we have this desire for neatness. I think this is a good quote from the essay that kind of summarizes a lot of it. Particularly when we're designing things or a master plan in front of us, neatness, order, simplicity, are sometimes very good design principles. But sometimes very, very complex systems, they actually break things down that are very natural. And so he argues that cities have to be grown. Each person kind of builds their house over time. It responds to the demands. It responds to the forces that are acting upon it, and it has to grow in response rather than one person dictating all of it. And so, I think it's a good way of kind of framing things because this is from the '60s, and so what I'm interested in is, and kind of what my work is based around, is how can humans actually interact with these generative systems, enabling them to kind of design past their cognitive abilities. How could someone design a city? How could you interact with some of those generative things I showed earlier, the chairs that are being optimized, the buildings that are being optimized. If humans can't understand all this complexity, how is it possible for them still to actually design with it, which I think is very interesting. And I think that's where software and generative design will really play a big part. And I'm also very inspired by a lot of the kind of biological metaphors in play here. Okay, so kind of tying into Christopher Alexander and all these things mean. You talked about growth and the growth of the city, the need for a city to grow. And coming from biology, when I was working in the lab, I was thinking a lot about kind of these relationships and the kind of the use of growth in the process. And in biology, it is growth that gives rise often to complexity. There is no oak tree. There is kind of, you have your genome, which is like your genes, and you have like your final result, called like the phenotype. There's this mapping between it. And often, there's no one oak tree. You have a genes for an oak tree, right? And each oak tree is different because it grew in its location. And that growth is really important because it allows the object to become much more complex. In a way, also from a computer science perspective, you can't optimize something. The more things you're optimizing, kind of the exponentially more difficult it gets. And you can imagine if you were trying to optimize, evolve a human, you don't evolve each cell, its XYZ position. You kind of evolve this like compressed genotype of it. And so the point being, there's a lot of kind of connections between optimization and growth and form, of course. And so plasticity is this term for biology. It basically means adaptability to the environment, where each oak tree, is uniquely situated in its context. And so I'm kind of motivated by these processes and kind of the design implications of the value of something being very adaptable to its environment. So now I'm talking about some of the projects I did that kind of came from some of these themes. So the first one I did a couple years ago, I was inspired by like floor plans and like architecture. And I was thinking, how could you grow a floor plan? How could you make something much more complicated, sophisticated? And if you could grow it, adapt it to its environment. But I did this kind of speculative project between art and design and research, somewhere in that area in between, called like evolving floor plan. So here's the original floor plan on the left, it was the high school. And I connected it to genetic algorithm, and I simulated all the people walking through the hallways. I did this thing called ant colony optimization to like lay out all the rooms to minimize the amount of walls that were being used. And on the right are also here with some like locations to the exit, and so they have kind of this like very organic quality to them. Obviously, it's like not supposed to be a practical building to build, tomorrow. But I was trying to create an algorithm that would kind of, here on the left is with windows, and then here's kind of like the growth process, the steps of the process where the rooms kind of come together. And this hallway kind of grows in the middle, similar to the way a vein would grow. This part of the veins, you don't encode all the veins in your genotype. Like they grow. It's a pattern for growing them in response to where the cells are and the demand of the cells. And I thought about how could you create hallways that way to kind of transport the people. And so the goal of this project was to be a little provocative with both the algorithm itself, where it's tying together these different graph algorithms, ant colony algorithms, and doing something that was a little kind of more funky. It also was just showing how optimization, there's a lot of room to think more outside of the box and kind of stuff was being done in architecture, because an optimized building shouldn't look like a regular building. And a lot of the generative architecture was trying to do things that look like traditional buildings, which didn't really make sense to me. Because of course you would expect it to look a lot different. So that was one project I did. Yeah.
Joe, could I just ask the color coding on the buildings?
On the rooms, I copied the original floor plan.
Right.
And so for some reason the original architect, this is something I took from the architect's website. This is the original plan. I don't know why they colored it this way. I think the bathrooms are in this kind of greenish, the midterm is red, and the classrooms are green, and some of the utilities are purple and blue. Yeah, so I took the colors. This is an elementary school. You see kind of the kindergarten, the PK, and some of these things kind of still cluster together. You have kindergarten here, you have PK here, second grade here, first grade here. And so yeah, cool. And so, okay, the next project I did is Corals project. Will the video work? That is the question. Okay. Very quick video. Okay, so I did this corals project where I created this algorithm to grow corals, and so like optimize coral shapes. And this may be a little more on the art side of things, but I was very inspired by how can you generate things of a much higher complexity and the value of growth in that process for arbitrary shapes. And so here's another little video of it. And so I created this growth algorithm that kind of takes this 3D object and optimizes its form. And so it's running in this environment where there's light, there's fluid, and so like a coral, or corals, they both kind of collect light in little bacteria living kind of in the polyps and kind of materials passing by for food. And so these things have like, in terms of complexity, they're a 3D mesh, tens of thousands of vertices, and I'm thinking, how could you generate something that complicated using kind of biological properties? And so I took these like reaction diffusion patterns, which are these types of patterns that can be simulated that are biologically inspired, where these kinds of crazy patterns can be generated by just tweaking parameters. But I had the corals actually optimize those, use those patterns in a functional way on their surface to create these kinds of, so the colors you see here are these morphogen patterns that it's learned how to use. And so I tied this to something called a genetic algorithm, which is a way of a biologically inspired kind of optimization algorithm. And so I was very interested in, how can you increase the complexity of the things that are being generated. And so on the right, you can see kind of you increase the amount of light is to the right, and I think the depth that is needed, and so depth is kind of going down, and light versus kind of current flow, more light to the right, more current flow to the left. You see, like as you change the environments, the corals themselves kind of optimize, differently, kind of different kind of shapes. Okay, and so, yeah.
So I'm assuming this works. That I use Houdini.
Oh, cool, yeah.
And I tried this out, like the diffusion algorithm.
Yeah.
Essentially, how it works is with the seed. You have a seed, like a growth, and then it's a seed, and then that seed grows from that initial seed point, like the multiple seed points.
I have not used Houdini.
Oh.
I'm familiar with it.
What do you use to run that simulation?
I wrote all the code in Python and C. And so the reaction diffusion is just like takes an initial state, and then each kind of chemical there's two chemicals that interact with one another, and they kind of diffuse, and the rate at which they diffuse and interact with each other by tweaking those two parameters is how you get these different patterns. You start off with noise, And so maybe Houdini has abstracted that in some way to make it easier. I'm not entirely sure how their system works, but Houdini is a really powerful tool from what I've seen. Yes. Okay. And so yeah, so both of these algorithms use growth as kind of an integral part in their process of generating complexity. Something I'm related to. Okay, and then kind of the third project in this kind of little bit of series is I was interested in, of course, like ecosystems. And so I did this ecosystem simulation because, of course, in biology, nothing's optimizing kind of on its own. Everything is kind of competing against all the things in its ecosystem. And so, oops, let me get the video is very little, thank you. I worked with this biologist PhD to create kind of a valid ecosystem model that was very visual. So a little resolution here. And so I guess, yeah, it's a little blurry. These are all little circles. I think I'm a plant-based model. And each little circle represents an individual, and each color is like one species. And you can kind of see the different populations kind of over time. And so I was very motivated by kind of like some of the beauty in kind of not only biological kind of like forms, but also biological kind of systems. And so like, yes, like, there's certain, trees and flowers and biological results are very beautiful. But is there also kind of a beauty to some of the systems, like the diversity of a forest, for instance, that has a certain amount of biodiversity? Is there beauty to those relationships, the way those relationships work? And so here, this system managed to like stabilize with like 5 oscillating patterns. And so these are the things that are like kind of authentic in the sense that like, this pattern here is, again, a little blurry. I could have created like a sketch to, pleasantly put out circles in a kind of a nice way. But this thing is like, it is is there a beauty to the fact that it is an authentic equilibrium that has emerged? So it's like it's a authentic equilibrium in an artificial world, but it is a real equilibrium, if that makes sense. And so, how could this tie in if you were, generating a city, in real estate, there's a beauty of the fact that things aren't homogeneous, that they there's a certain diversity to it. The same way like a forest would be, I would think less beautiful with only one tree as opposed to kind of different trees that kind of evolve to all be complementary in certain ways. And, are there certain patterns like that we can see in cities, or maybe you don't want one really bold, building a whole block. Maybe there's a certain balance to that kind of, to that ecosystem. And so that was kind of another, and so on the right, I kind of analyzed the different individuals and how they work together. Okay, so then kind of the question that for me was, all right, we have these generative systems, if it's the corals or the floor plans or all the other stuff with optimization. I kind of like to make tools for people. I wanted to, how can people interact with them? And so some of the stuff I'm doing lately is tools for interacting with these generative models. But I'm going to start off with kind of how I thought about it, which is the question, what is the most complex human design that humans have designed? Kind of related to Christopher Alexander and stuff like that. Thinking about, all right, we want to interact with really complicated things. Maybe it's worth thinking about what are the most complicated things humans have designed so far. So I don't know. What do people think? It's a little bit of a silly question, but I don't know, like a Boeing 747, like a Intel CPU. I don't know. But whatever you think it is, it's a computer, there's a nuclear power plant. I like to say, a little provocatively, it's not entirely fair. I like to say the answer is dogs, actually. I would say dogs. These are my parents' dogs. This is Mr. Cody and Mr. Miles. They're very cute, they're very nice. So I like to say dogs are the most complicated things humans have ever designed. And, it's not a perfect comparison. We designed them from wolves, but like, there are between 10 and 50 trillion cells in a dog. If you think about that level of complexity, that's a tremendous amount of complexity. 10 to 50 trillion interacting parts. That's much greater than anything else humans have designed. And in a sense, we designed them from wolves. We don't know exactly how they work, but we still designed them, right? And we don't know exactly how all the physics work, and we still used it. We still were able to, create transistors and stuff like that. And so to me, like that was pretty interesting. Like we designed dogs, and it's a pretty successful design story, right? Like they're super functional and like. Sorry, you raised your hand?
No, but I was thinking about dog poop. in cities, dogs.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Cities aren't right for dogs.
Yeah.
But you know, like companionship, you know, they protect us traditionally. You know, therapy dogs, hunting dogs, herding dogs. They're super functional. Like it's kind of incredible. And we designed them. And so, like to me, that was pretty interesting. So I thought, like, well, that was a design process. What can be learned from that? And so that's actually what motivated a lot of my work. And if you think about it, like breeding as this interface to complexity. If you think about it, breeding has been the traditional way we interact with complexity. Breeding was the design interface. And so if you think about breeding is kind of cool. You think about like design properties of breeding, and you think about it radically simple. Like, we did not even know how dogs worked, and we were still able to do it. We didn't even know we were doing it. We just picked the best pup of the litter each time, which is a design process, it's active selection, and somehow we got dogs at the end of it. And so it kind of reduces design to selection. It was also, I mean, in the beginning, you know, it was decentralized, it was democratic and collaborative. There was no early, 10,000 years ago committee to design, laying out the properties we wanted for each dog. Each person kind of picked the dog they liked best, and somehow, or I guess in the beginning we picked the wolf pup they liked best, and collectively we got dogs. And also the design process, it allowed specialization. Different regions got different dogs for different purposes. And it was post-human complexity. No one knew how a dog worked, their immune system, whatever, but we were still able to do it. And so to me, when I was looking at some of these systems, breeding just made a lot of sense as kind of this natural interface. And so I started thinking, how could you breed buildings the way you breed dogs, and what would that enable? Okay, so briefly talking about other kind of research related to this, which also was very inspiring, and I think relates to the idea of like how algorithms can inspire designers. And this thing called novelty search. We'll talk about it very, very briefly. And novelty search is this software that someone wrote, Kenneth Stanley, professor, wrote, early 2000s, that would present images to you, and you would kind of pick the image you like the best, and then it would create variants of it for you. And what was so cool about pick reading, people would discover these kind of wild, fascinating, amazing images. And from a computer science point of view, if you found those images, and you then try to run an optimization to recreate the image, it often wouldn't work, or it would take hundreds of thousands of time steps. And what's interesting about that is, a lot of times, really interesting things are often like a few little stepping stones away, but it's never obvious how to get there. And people are able to discover wild and interesting images on here, and without really knowing what they're planning for, they're often very hard to get to, because often the stepping stones to get to an image were never clear. And he actually ties this into, he's an academic computer science researcher. He actually found, so this is a little experiment where little robots are trying to get to a goal from here. So imagine each dot is the endpoint of a little robot trying to go through the maze. I don't know if that's clear. And when here are all the robots optimized for getting to the goal. And so most of them kind of end up here, at this local maximum. But if instead you optimize each robot to just be different from all the robots around it, more of them would actually get to the goal by accident. And so what I think is so interesting about this and how it relates to kind of, creative processes in general is just the power of pursuing novelty for its own sake, and how objectives can often be very deceptive. Where, and I think the example he uses is, if you're a child and you wanted your child to be Beethoven, and each day you measured what percentage of Beethoven you were, you tried to optimize for that, your child would become Beethoven, because great things cannot be planned. He has a book on this. And so this relates to breeding in the sense that this is a project called Pick Breeder, where you kind of each image would present children for you. And so breeding is not only powerful, I think, as those other properties, but as a method for presenting surprise and discovery and exploration. And so And I think that pertains to a lot of things in life that you talked about, kind of, in a larger context of how often by chasing objectives in our personal lives, we miss out on kind of these amazing accidents that are waiting to happen through unexpected stepping stones. And I think that's just a very valuable, or very kind of insightful way of thinking about things that's related to breeding that he developed and was a very big inspiration for me. And so kind of based off this, one of the projects I did recently was this thing called GANBreeder. And you can try it out today at ganbreeder.app. It's a lot of fun, I think. And so what GANBreeder was basically an experiment that I did in can you make a breeding interface inspired by the breeder, originally intended for floor plans. Can you make breeding a really, really fun interface and a really, really fun way of creating things? And so GANBreeder is a way of basically breeding images and making images through breeding them collaboratively. And so for any image you see, it'll create children similar to PickBreeder, very similar to PickBreeder. And this uses kind of some of the recent machine learning stuff that's been happening in the last 3 years, something called generative adversarial networks. Next year might be something called something else, what's the new trendy thing, the name doesn't matter. But in fact, these algorithms are like, the last 4 years have been kind of a revolution, or a huge advance at least, in what images can be generated by some of the systems. And so the point being, you can easily, you can go from basically a couple of numbers to an image, and if you kind of slightly tweak those numbers, you get a slightly different image. And so you can turn that into kind of a breeding interface. And you can also, add the numbers binding the two images together and get an image in the middle. And so it's kind of a very fun way to create. And so you go to your GANBreeder.app, it's an interface like this, where it just asks you which image is most interesting. And if you click on an image, it'll then produce children for you, kind of variants of it. And if you then click on one of those children, there's more variants of it. And you kind of fall down this rabbit hole of creating images. You can also, you mix an image with any other image, and you can also kind of in the third view, you can kind of fine adjust the things that make up an image, kind of the genes of the image, if that makes sense. So kind of biologically motivated interface for creating images. That kind of map to how intentional are you versus how explorative you are in that moment. Because I feel like a lot of the creative process, maybe later, parts of it are more intentional, but parts of it are often kind of more open-ended, more based on exploration and discovery. And so I was interested in tools that reflect that. And often it's more collaborative. So you can take anyone's image, all the images are a URL, and so you can send anyone your image, they can then mix that image into their own images, you can browse kind of the top images. And so I'm very interested in kind of how, I think there's a lot of power in kind of creative networks, how people kind of build off one another. A lot of creativity is collaborative, a lot of it's based off exploration, so I wanted to make a tool that reflected that. So that's GANBreeder. But the idea being that it's a generalized interface where you could also have, buildings in there. You could have a typography system in there that could vary and it should alter. And the nice thing with the children is it's really, it's suggesting things to you. So there's a lot of room there for surprise. And so, if it was a typography system or a layout, you can imagine it as a way of exploring and then, mixing together and fine-tuning. And this slide here, you see how different versus how similar you want the children to be. So kind of early on in the process, you can kind of be a little more broad and kind of narrow in.
Are those homepage images kind of random, or are they categorical? For which image is most interesting?
So half of them are totally randomly created. The other half are images that someone had liked. Yeah.
So, and they'll change every time?
Every time you reload it, it'll change, yeah. And if you go to create, you can mix any two things together. You can be I want a hot dog and a teddy bear and see what happens. And so, yeah, people use it for album art, concept art. People use it for inspiration kind of a thing. It's limited by what the network was trained on, in a sense. But a huge diversity can come out of it. And it was cool to see that, artists actually develop their own style using it. So I wasn't sure what would happen because it seems so simple, like, would it all just kind of look the same? What would it come out of it? But people really learned how to use it. People would kind of figure out the right images to mix together, or how to mix them, or what things to mix in there. You know, certain artists would literally love particular things, you know, a door or like a pumpkin. Artists would like know how to use it the right way. And so like, you know, creative people always know how to kind of push these tools, which is very interesting to kind of see that emerge. But the interview raises a lot of interesting questions, you know. First of all, like, what is it? Is it a game? Is it a social network? Is it a tool? It kind of like feels like a game, kind of looks like a social network, but you're making images at the end of it. So, you know, what is it? And also like creation and exploration. If you're just picking next image, next image, next image, and then that image you kind of discover, like, did you create that? Or did you discover it? Or, you know, what's the difference? And, you know, and so who owns the images, and how should kind of ownership work? And this has actually been a really interesting question lately. There's been actually some disputes or some debates about it, because right now all images are kind of publicly owned, or they're public at least. And so, you know, some people were building things on top of GANGreader. So if someone built a system where they would control the entire system through like biosensors, they would like measure their heart rate and their like blood pressure, and it would like present one image at a time, and then take the image that it like best. So you could control the whole system entirely non-physically. And then we sold prints of these images. However, they looked a lot like images other people had created on the system, and then a lot of people online accused that person of basically stealing their images. And so, you know, I mean, I think there was some kind of like misunderstanding about what was going on. But in general, I mean, you know, what is the line between, you know, discovery versus like actual creation? Like, if someone creates an image, how much, you know, do we own of it? Because for each image, you look at the whole lineage of all the changes that were made to it, and you can kind of see that whole progression of the image over time, and everyone's will change over time. And so that final image, you know, who should own it? Does anyone own it at all? And I don't have an image of that lineage, but you can see it. So that's kind of a different question. And I think a lot of these kind of AI tools, there's a lot more people being involved in the process of creating it. Or if you're machine learning, you know, who collected the data set, who trained the model, who built the interface for interacting with it, who made, you know, the image that, or the object that you branched off of and you changed. And so there are a lot more people kind of in play in the creative process. And you know, there's a larger trend with a lot of, you know, generative computational design. There's kind of more parts involved. And so ownership may have to be, you know, adapted to this. I may actually see this in research where, you know, you're making a very small contribution to a much larger stack of things. And so there's kind of a culture of heavy citation that's there. That's kind of a little bit less there at art now, and that may have to change. You know, where, you know, who wrote the scraping code, and there was that Sotheby's instance where, you know, an artist, you know, someone else used their code and they made a painting which sold for a huge amount of money. And that was an issue. So a lot of these questions are kind of right at the forefront right now, and yet to be resolved.
Did you saw the question?
Oh,
Oh yeah. So like, is there like an API or library that you use to create this interface between
So all the code is open source on the website if you want to look around at it, or the version of it is open source. I used Google had a machine learning library for interacting with the image generator. It's TensorFlow. I think DeepMind released, it's called Big GAN. It's their machine learning model they released. And so yeah, they open source the image generating module. And in addition to using that, and then it's a bunch of like web code, server code, client code on top of that. What was cool was that like beforehand, to run it, you needed like an expensive GPU. And so there were people who were kind of creating images out of it. But once you can network everyone together, the kind of a lot of the interesting images, like, the quality went up a lot, and like kind of the exploration of the space went up a lot. Now everyone can kind of like explore and kind of create together, and so there were so many images that were there that like wouldn't have been discovered otherwise.
So when we're using the app, actually, are we processing some of that on the GPU of our computer?
No, it's on the server.
It's all on the server.
On the server. Yeah, that's how you ever use it, like on your phone or quickly. It'd be constantly doing it. And a lot of this machine learning stuff is still generally inaccessible, and that you need like a pretty expensive setup to get it running, and like a technical hurdle to installing all the libraries and the software and getting it all kind of connected. And so, that's why I think the value of like really, really simple tools, like built on top of these generative models, will be so important. Because a lot of them are still kind of behind a great amount of complexity to even get them running. There's a lot of powers like making them radically simple. And that was kind of like goal of engineering, like how can you kind of take away all the excess in the interface. I talk about that. Okay, so then going back to like the city is not a tree, how would you design a city? And so the way I think about it, kind of taking all the different things I mentioned, I kind of wrap it in this term I'm calling like morphogenic design, which is like design inspired by the processes of kind of biology and by breeding rather than just some of the results. So a lot of that is something, so we're kind of contrasting that something called like biomimetic design, which is like valid and has its place and like looks at ways of like learning from some of the like results of biology. But I think there are a lot of like interesting systems and processes and then like breeding as the design interface. And you're tying these things together in kind of this umbrella for morphogenic design, where you have adaptability, you have optimization. So what does this mean exactly? Where imagine, you were breeding images, but maybe you were breeding, maybe it's design interfaces, and each one is complicated because it has to be adapt, to any different place that you would put it. If it's a billboard or a different kind of resolution on a screen, and you kind of optimize for all those different possibilities at once. The type of adaptability, or a building, a suburban home. What if you want to design one suburban home? You design it so it can grow in its environment to its kind of the terrain map that are there, the sun paths that are there, to existing trees. You could design, not just one building, you design kind of the pattern for growing the building adapted in its environment. And so I think generative design can enable that kind of designing things more abstractly, so they can be kind of context specific, which is kind of one of those kind of abstract patterns that I think is relevant. And just to summarize everything, kind of morphogenic design. The first one I think actually pertains to like generative design more broadly, not just morphogenic design. Is so, I'm kind of optimistic about the role of computation in the creative process. There are people who are more pessimistic about kind of what it will do to jobs and employment. The way I think about it now, like something like Animator, what does it allow you to do? It allows you to kind of express your intent at a higher level. I like this direction. I don't like that direction. Show me more of this. Show me less of that. And you kind of operate at a higher level. Think about it now. Like that's what a creative director does, right? You go to their underlings and they're like, "This is a good direction. Dude, show me more of that." And the creative underlings, go out and they kind of do that manual labor. And then what generative design can do is you can kind of bring everyone up to that level of creative director, where you just point to something and point to a direction, like, show me more options here. And if it's not images, some other kind of work. I think that can be incredibly empowering, where that is kind of back and forth of all right, I like this direction, show me more of that direction. The algorithm can suggest things to you, and it can run a lot of variations and iterations. And so I think that would be a lot of the future of the creative process. You kind of brought it to that higher level, empowered by some of these generative tools. And there's some kind of nonsense out there about like AI designers, AI artists. That's of course all nonsense, because what is design? It's about empathy. It's about weighing these different objectives against one another, making these value judgments. And the algorithm will never be able to do any of those things, but it can present options to you, it can present transparency, you can automate that work of producing iteration. And I think that can really kind of augment, speed up the design process. Being able to suggest, have it suggest things to you, surprise you with stuff is very, very powerful. And so I think the next kind of big conclusion, or conclusion from this, is I think breeding democratizes complexity, which I think is really, really powerful generally. GAN breeder, people have no, artistic background, no background in making images. They can still use GAN breeder really easily to make images. Because breeding is just picking what you like. And humans are what are really good at. We're really good at judging things and being like, I like that, I don't like that. And so, an interface that kind of reduces design selection, I think, is really powerful because, if it's floor plans, if it's, if it's music that are being presented to you, you pick the one you like the best, and you keep doing that iteratively, and you'll design something that's really powerful, and that allows lots of people to do it. And you see that now with architecture, or really complicated things. The more complicated something gets, the fewer people there are who can design for it. And so kind of complexity leads to kind of convergence of style. And so what if you can kind of decouple those? What if you can have, more people who can interact with these complex generative things? A lot of problems in the future will kind of increase in complexity, and should make that more accessible. Anyway, I'm going to summarize everything a little bit more. I think one of the ways that I think this will kind of challenge the way people think about design is, if now we say, I designed something, they might have to become, we bred something like a genome together. There's a different way of thinking about it, where it's a collective task. It's not about designing, it's about kind of breeding this back and forth with this suggestion engine. And it's not about a final result, it's about kind of the abstract thing that's then context adaptive. And so I think that can all be summarized in this kind of way of thinking about, I designed something to rebred a genome. Okay, and then the last thing, which is kind of how I think about a lot of this stuff tying together, and I think from more art and the design point of view, is I think, in terms of I think some types of beauty, not all beauty, obviously, but a lot of beauty, I think is based around optimization. Maybe from a Christopher Alexander, all the forces that are acting upon it. Maybe it's a tree that is, been optimized to, all the different objectives it has to satisfy. And I think, there's maybe a beauty to that underlying being, the form being optimized. Do we find, an ecosystem that is in equilibrium, kind of beautiful for its kind of structural properties. And I think that optimization will have to come from emergence, and then growth, and then to understand emergence and understand growth. So kind of growth leads to emergence, which leads to optimization, which leads to beauty, and that's kind of how I summarize a lot of my work. And then I'm going to leave it with, or almost leave it, something with dogs. Again, I like dogs. Talking about some of actually the ethics behind it, and so generative tools, like any tool, have a lot of ethical concerns or risks associated with them. So I don't know if you followed it, a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI, this AI research lab, produces text model that could produce incredibly realistic paragraphs and phrases and documents. And they actually didn't release it. They're like, we made this thing, but we're not going to release it because it's too powerful. And the reason they're trying to create this incredible propaganda generating bots. You could create a spam bot. And some of those faces you saw in the beginning, you could easily create fake identities. And each of those identities then produce fake text, fake propaganda. There's a lot of ways of misusing it. And that's part of what's giving rise to a lot of the fear of AI in society now. Mass propaganda bots, fake identities, impersonating people, deepfakes. And so, obviously, as design tools make these technologies more accessible, you also have, the other half of that is a lot of the risks also get amplified as the creative capacity get amplified. And so the way I think about it, and the reason why I'm generally optimistic, is you can tie back to breeding. And I talk about how great breeding is. It's kind of my unifying metaphor. But on the other hand, breeding gave us dogs, and dogs are great. But breeding also gave us, things like this. It's like monstrosity chickens, that can't hold up their weight. They're very unhealthy. Pugs too, where, they have terrible health conditions. A lot of chickens are, they couldn't live in the environment. They couldn't support themselves. They're kind of monstrosities. And so the reason I tie the recent risk with AI is kind of the breeding into animals is the sense that in some sense it's kind of there's a history, a very long history here of any new design, affordances giving, the more powerful design, the better and the worse the outcome can be. And so they said with breeding, we created these kind of monstrosity animals that are unhealthy and sick and, can barely walk around. And also they have dogs. I think with generative design, it's going to kind of be the same thing as with any kind of new tool or new ability. I think, it will give us kind of both the best and the worst. And that's kind of something to keep in mind as designers can interact with these systems. Okay, to wrap up, I'm creating, video gonna work? Okay. I'm now doing this company called Morphogen, doing morphogenic design. And I made this website in reaction to fusion simulation. It was extravagant, and I wanted to, and it's fun. So that's what I'm doing now, it's called Morphogen. The website is all in reaction to fusion shaders, because I could. And yeah, thank you very much.